Good morning, Mom. I am Dingal Liza Mae C, and I will be reporting today. Institutional corrections is a prison refers to the penal establishments under the control of Bureau of Corrections. So, institutional corrections, it is the treatment and rehabilitation of offenders through a program involving penal custody, parole, and provision. Also, the administration of such treatment as a matter to provide control, custody, and care to any person convicted a crime. So the main purpose of institutional corrections is that they focus on rehabilitation and regards inmates as patients who need treatment and guidance in order to become productive and responsible members of society upon their release. Next, definition of terms. Bureau of Corrections is an agency under the Department of Justice that is charged with custody and rehabilitation of national offenders, that is, those sentenced to serve a term of imprisonment of more than 3 years. So, um, the Bureau of Corrections, they carry out its mandate and they undertakes the following: confine persons convicted by the court to serve a sentence in national prisons and keep prisoners from committing crimes while in custody. So, prison define a penitentiary is a place where people have been convicted of major serious crimes are imprisoned or incarcerated. And prison also a location set up for the purpose of keeping offenders in safe custody or incarceration. So, prison, it is a place of a long-term confinement for those convicted of serious crimes and holds people convicted of crime. So, the prison established for the purpose of taking safe custody and confinement of criminals. Next, prison is also known as jail, detention center, penitentiary, and correctional facility. So, we talk about this in the next page. So, jail is defined as a place of confinement for inmates under investigation or undergoing trial or serving short-term sentences. And the old name or the term of jail is what we call gaol. And jail, it is a place of locking up of persons who are convicted of minor minor offenses or felonies, who are to serve a short sentences imposed upon them by a competent court, or for confinement of persons who are awaiting trial or investigations of their case. So next is detention center. So what is detention center? It is an institution where people are held in detention for short periods, in particular undocumented immigrants, refugees, people awaiting trial or sentence, or young offenders. So place where juveniles are held captive when they are detained. So next, penitentiary is a prison or correctional facility that houses people who have been convicted of a crime. So, penitentiary, it is a prison for big-time criminals convicted of a big-time crimes, commit a serious crime like a murder, and you won't just go to jail and you will be sent to penitentiary. Next is correctional facilities. It is a place where people are kept when they have been arrested and are being punished for a crime, and a prison that state's largest correctional facility is nearly full. So correctional facilities, it includes prisons and jails also, where people are kept when they have been arrested and are being punished for a crime. So, in the next page, there are two phases of correction. So, first, contemporary correction. So, first, contemporary phase is also known as non-institutional correction. So, it includes pardon, provision, and peril activities, correctional administration, not directly connectable to institutions. So, next is traditional phase correction is all or what we called institutional correction. So they think done to offenders when they are isolated from the community. That aspect of the correctional enterprise that involves the incarceration and rehabilitations of adults and juveniles convicted of offenses against the law on the confinement of persons isolated or suspected of a crime awaiting trial and judgment. So, correction defined is a branch of criminal justice system concerned with custody, supervision, and rehabilitation of criminal offenders. So, correction, it is the study of jail administration and management as well as criminal rehabilitation and information if and it is a broad phase that encompasses all government agencies, buildings, programs, employees, and practices involved in the intake, detention, monitoring, or treatment of alleged criminals. The purpose of correction is to rehabilitate the offender, and the ultimate goal of correction is to reform and rehabilitate convicted individuals and restore them in their prior status before and the commission of the crime as law-abiding citizens. So let's talk about custody. So custody, these are to protective care of guardianship of someone inside the jails, and supervision, this an action of supervising someone inside the jail, and rehabilitation of criminal offenders. It is a central goal of the correctional systems that this goal rests on the assumption that individuals can be treated and desist from the crime. So there are five purposes of correction. First, retribution. So when we say retribution, it is a punishments inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. And next, incapacitation. It refers to the act of making an individual incapable of committing a crime. Next is rehabilitation. So meaning it is was expanded to mean restore to sound operation or to establish the good reputation. And next is deterrence. So the crime prevention effects of the threat of punishments. And so next is restoration. So these are the victims or the offenders and communities affected by a particular offense made to find a way to restore or make amends for the harm resulting from an offense. Next is correction as a process. So it refers to the reorientation of a criminal offender in order to prevent him or her from repeating deviant or delinquent behavior without the need for punitive measures but rather the implementation of specific reform initiatives. So when we say correction as a process, so, it refers to the reorientation of a criminal offender in order to prevent him or her from repeating deviant or delinquent behavior. The correctional process begins at sentencing from the time an offender is initially assessed through case management and to supervision in the community. There is a team of dedicated professionals working closely with the offender. So there are two rival prison systems. First, the IU-born prison systems. It is the congregate system where prisoners are confined in their own cells during the night and congregate work in shops during the day. So IU-born, it is a harsh punishment where the slaves work every morning and they until in the evening they work at night. And in the Pennsylvania prison system, it is a solitary system where persons are confined single cells day and night. So Pennsylvania, it is a cold punishment and they wait for their own food. So, the history of prison. From the birth of modern civilization in 3rd millennia before Christ, almost every major ancient civilization used concept of prisons as a mean to detain and remove personal freedoms of incarcerated people. So prisons were frequently used as a temporary stopgap before being sentenced to death or a life of slavery in the early periods of history. So, but as time passed and our civilization progressed, prisons began to evolve into correctional facilities that implemented the concept of prisoners' rehabilitation and reform. And prisons were frequently used to house political prisoners, state opponents, and prisoners of war, in addition to convicted or suspected criminals. The earliest records of prisons came from the first millennia BC, located in the areas of mighty ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the earliest records of prisons come from the first millennia BC, located in the areas of mighty ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So prisons were early always stationed in underground dungeons throughout ancient times when guilty or suspected criminals spent their lives awaiting death or a mandate to become slaves, or often working as a galley slaves. In ancient Roman Empire, however, continued to use harsher methods. So their jails were nearly entirely subterranean with squeezing corridors and cramped chambers. Prisoners were imprisoned in basic cells or were shackled to the walls for life or for a set period of time, because slavery was the recognized norm at the time, and the majority of individuals who were not sentenced to death were sold as slaves or utilized as labor by the Roman authorities. So next is gladiators in ancient Rome, a man trained to fight with weapons against other men or wild animals in an arena. So in the next slide, I have here an example of gladiator. That is an example of gladiator. There are all slaves fighting each other. Next is Henry II commissioned the construction of first prison in 1166, along with the first draft of the English legal system, which included the concept of a jury in 1215. One of the most important pieces of present legislation was introduced. So when King John signed Magna Carta, which stated that no man could be imprisoned without trial, with the rise of the industry between 16th and 18th century, English prisons became overcrowded and new penal measures started being implemented. And military pardon and penal transportations during the end of 18th century, over 50,000 prisoners were transported from England to penal colonies in North America and Australia. So the modern period of prisons began with a series of jail improvements in 19th century and England. During this time, inmates began to receive more care. The concept of rehabilitation was introduced, and governments all over the world, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, began to reconsider their views on solitary confinement, which was primary source of the increased numbers of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners. So the international wars that consume uh, the world at the turn of the 20th century resulted in the establishment of a vast number of war prison camps and concentration camps. Next, there are two modern incarceration where banishment and transportation. So when we say banishment, it is a form of punishment imposed on an individual, usually by a country or state, in which the individual is forced to remain outside of that country or state. So there are different types of prisons in antiquity times. So when we say antiquity times, it is the time in history that preceded in the Middle Ages. So that is an example of the prisons before. So, penology, it is the main function is to prevent criminal offenses by setting a standard bar of giving huge punishment. So, for example, when someone is found guilty of stealing money, then there is a set norm of punishment. So, this practice demotivates the idea of criminology and thus acts as maintaining righteous things in the society. So we're going to the primary schools of penology. So first, classical school, the doctrine of psychological hedonism or free will. So when we say hedonism, it is a pursuit of pleasure. So classical school, it is that gives emphasis on the crime, not on the criminal. So this assumes that every individual has free will and knows the penal law. It postulates that man is rational and calculating being who acts with reference to the feelings of pleasure and pain. So next, neoclassical school, children and lunatics must be free from punishment. So when we say neoclassical school, it is modified the classical theory and introduce the concepts that mitigating circumstances might inhibit the exercise of free will and that punishment should be rehabilitative. And next, positivist school denied individuals responsibility and reflected on positive reactions to crime and criminality. So, in positivism school, this rejects the classical notion that individuals have free will and rationality chooses to commit crime. So, it assumes that criminal behavior is determined by biological, psychological, and social factors. Next is penal management. It refers to the manner or practice of managing or controlling places of confinement as in jails or prisons. Penal management, it is a program that prepare individuals to plan and manage institutional facilities and programs for housing and rehabilitating prisoner in the public or private sector. And correctional administration, it is the study and practice of a system management of jails or prisons and other institutions concerned with the custody, treatment, and rehabilitation of criminal offenders. So, correctional administration, it is one of the imperatives, nay, or pillars of criminal justice administration. It is the task to save, keep, and rehabilitate those convicted by the courts, and it is in the corrections where the better part, which is greater duration of a sentenced person as he spends the judicially prescribed penalty, and it careers are those who oversee the operations of corrections officers in prisons and provide leadership, supervision, and mentoring for other prison staff members. There are three approach alternative to imprisonment such as provision, and under in the provision there are juvenile provision and adult provision. So what is provision? So uh, provision, it is a disposition under which an accused after conviction and sentence is really subject to the conditions imposed by the court and to the supervision of a provision officer. And by provision, a person convicted of a criminal offense is not sent to a prison by the sentencing court, and instead he or she is released and placed under the supervision officer subject to the condition which the court may impose. And juvenile provision, it is covering offenders ages 9 and under 18, PD 603 as amended by RA 9344, and adult provision covering ages 18 and above, PD 968. And parole, what is parole? So parole, it is the release of a prisoner from prison after serving the minimum period of his indeterminate sentence. And pardon, there are two kinds of pardon. First, absolute pardon and conditional pardon. So, what is pardon? So, pardon is an act of executive clemency by a head of state for the purpose of accepting an individual from the punishment imposed upon him by a court of law, and it is an act of grace, and the recipient is not entitled to at is matter of right. And what is absolute pardon? Absolute pardon, it is the service serves to wipe away the guilt of a pardonee and makes him innocent as if he has not committed any crime. And conditional pardon, it is the conditional when it is granted by the chief executive subject to the conditions imposed on the recipient and accepted by him. Usually, the person granted with conditional pardon has served a portion at least one half of the minimum of his intermediate. Next. So provision, so what I said a while ago, that the provision is a person that convicted of a criminal offense is not sent to prison by the sentencing court. Instead, he or she is released and placed under the supervision of a provision officer subject to the condition which the court may impose. And parole, as what I said a while ago, that the parole is release of a prisoner from the prison after serving the minimum period of his indeterminate sentence. The Philippine correctional system is composed of 5 agencies belonging to 3 departments, namely, first, Department of Justice. So, Department of Justice, it ensures that the federal laws seeks just punishment for the guilty and ensures the fair of impartial administration of justice. So first, under the Department of Justice is Bureau of Corrections or BUCOR. So the BUCOR is an agency under the Department of Justice that is charged with custody and rehabilitation of national offenders, that is those sentenced to serve a term of imprisonment of more than 3 years. So to carry out its mandate, the BUCOR undertakes the following, like confined persons convicted the courts to serve a sentence in national prisons, and also they keep prisoners from committing crime while in custody, and and they provide human treatment by supplying inmates basic needs and implementing a variety of rehabilitation programs designed to change their pattern of criminal or antisocial behavior. And also they engage in agro industrial projects for the purpose of developing persons presence lands and manpower skills and labor, and also they providing prisoners with a source of income and augmenting the bureau's yearly appropriations. And then next is the Parole and Provision Administration or PPA. So it is mandated to conserve and or redeem convicted offenders and um, prisoners who are under the provision or parole system. Then the third one is the Board of Pardons and Parole. So it releases uh, prisoners on parole and recommends the grant of presidential pardons, and they also supervises the rehabilitation of parolees as well as the provisioners. So next is Department of the Interior and Local Government or DILG. So under for this is BGMP, which runs the city or municipal and district jails and the provincial jails through the respective provincial governments. So um, the Philippine government responsible for promoting peace and order, ensuring public safety, and strengthening local government capability, um, aim towards the effective delivery of basic services to the citizenry. Next is the Department of Social Welfare and Development, DSWD, Child and
Youth Welfare Bureau that takes care of the sentenced youth offenders, which are located in the 10th Regional Youth Rehabilitation Centers nationwide. So, this WD shall provide the victims temporarily shelter, like they provide counseling, psychosocial services, and recovery, the recovery of youth offenders, and also the rehabilitation program and livelihood assistance, and also the primary government agency mandated to develop, implement, and coordinate social protection, especially for the youth offenders, and poverty reduction solutions for and with the poor, vulnerable, and disadvantaged.
Next is the imprisonment or incarceration. So it is the act of confinement of a person in prison, restraint of one's personal liberty, forcible detentions of a man's persons of his movement. So it is an institution for the confinement of persons who have been remanded or held in custody by a judicial authority, or who have been deprived of their liberty following conviction for a crime. A person found guilty of a felony or a misdemeanor by may be required to serve a prison sentence, then the holding of accused persons awaiting trial remains an important function of contemporary persons, and in some countries such persons constitute the majority of the prison's population. So next is inmate. So it is a person committed to jail, prison by a competent court or authority for any of the following reasons. So first, to serve a sentence after conviction, under trial, and under investigation. So when we say inmate, so it is a like persons that confined to an institution such as a prisons or hospital. To serve a sentence after conviction, it is a was actually ordered or could be ordered by a trial court in a criminal procedure, and it is forms the final explicit act of judge rule process, as well as the symbolic principal act connected to their functions. So next is the under trial. um, in the under trial, it is in situation like in which evidence against one is presented in a court to a judge and often a jury to decide if one is guilty of a crime. On trial for murderer, then she went or trial for possession of drugs. Next is under investigation. So under investigation is it is being investigate or being looked into to try to find out the facts that the accidents under investigation. Next is there are general category of inmates: the sentenced prisoner, detention prisoner, and person for safekeeping. So in sentenced prisoner, these are the persons who are convicted by final judgment and serving their sentences. Then the next is detention prisoner. So in detention prisoners, these are the prisoners awaiting court trial or court disposition. And then next is the persons for safekeeping. It is a prisoner in jail or persons so detained for reasons of a personal security and the protection of the community from committing simple misconduct. In the next slide, they're classified of sentenced prisoners. So first, national or what we call insular prisoner. Next is the provincial prisoner, and next city prisoner and municipal prisoner. So when we say national or insular prisoner, um, these are the under of Bokor inmate, a prisoner sentenced to an imprisonment exceeding 3 years. And in the provincial prisoner, it is a provincial jail inmate that a prisoner sentenced to an imprisonment exceeding 6 months but not more than years. Next is the city prisoners or the VGMP inmate. These are the prisoners sentenced to an imprisonment exceeding 1 month but not more than 3 years in its maximum. And then the last one is the municipal prisoner. Under for the VGMP inmate that a prisoner sentenced to an imprisonment exceeding 1 month in its minimum but not more than 6 months in its. The next classification of prisoners as to security risk. So an inmate shall be assigned to any of the following security groups. So the minimum security prisoners, um, this shall include highly dangerous or high security risks as determined by the classification board who require a high degree of control and supervision. So, who are the maximum security prisoners? So, those are the sentenced to death. Then those who minimum sentence is 20 years imprisonment, and also they remand inmates or detainees whose sentence is 20 years and above, and those whose sentence is under review by the C. And those with the pending cases, there are many cases that are pending, and also those under disciplinary punishment or safekeeping. The next is the medium security prisoners. This shall include those who cannot be trusted in less secure areas and those who conduct or behavior require minimal supervision. So, who are medium security prisoners? So, those minimum sentence is less than 20 years imprisonment, and also those who have two or more records of escapes, and they are classified as medium security if they have served 8 years since they were recommitted. Those with one record of escape must serve 5 years. The minimum security prisoners. So they shall include those who can reasonably trusted to serve their sentences under less restricted conditions. So who are minimum security prisoners? So um, those who have 6 months more to serve before the expiration of their maximum sentence. Next, colors of uniforms of inmates as to security classification. So, in maximum security, their uniform of inmates is tangerine or what we call orange. And medium security, the colors of their uniforms of inmates is blue. And the minimum security, the colors of their uniforms of inmates is brown. Next is the concept of punishment. So, what is punishment? So, punishment is the suffering inflicted by the state for the transgression of a law and a loss perpetrator suffering or the like to which one subjects oneself by non-fulfillment of some obligation. So, punishment, these are the infliction of some kind of pain or loss upon a person's for a misdeed, for example, the transgression of a law or command. Punishment may take forms ranging from capital punishments like flogging, force, labor, and mutilation of the body to imprisonment and fines. Next, ancient forms of punishment. So the death penalty, it is a state-sanctioned practice of killing a person as a punishment of a crime. So in the death penalty, it is also called capital punishment, where execution of an offender's sentence to death after conviction by a court of law of a criminal offense. And also death penalty should be distinguished from extrajudicial execution carried out without due process of law. The next is the physical torture, includes being deprived of food, water, or being forced feed food or excrement of drugs. So, in physical torture, this include but is not limited to beatings, burns from cigarettes or chemicals, cuts like mga electric, and also being forced to stare into the sun, like excrement of or drugs, and against the wall or floor, stabbing, and forced amputation. And next is the social degradation. So in social degradation, um, it humiliates or debases an individuals, showing a lack of respect for or diminishing their human dignity, and or when it arouses feelings or fear, and also inferiority capable of breaking an individual's moral and physical resistance. So next is the banishment or exile. It is a form of punishments imposed on an individual, usually by a country or state, in which the individual is forced to remain outside of that country or state. So um, banishment or exile, it prolongs absence from one's country imposed by vested authority as a punitive measures, and it most likely originated among early civilizations from the practice of designating an offender and uh, outcast and depriving him of the comfort and protection of his group, and also other similar forms of punishment like transportation and slavery. Next is glutton and garrote. So these are the examples of punishments before. So guillotine, it is a instrument for inflicting capital punishment by decapitation, introduced into France in 1792. The device consists of two upright posts surmounted by a crossbeam and grooved so as to guide an oblique edged knife, the back of which is heavily weighted to make it fall forcefully upon and slice through the neck of a prone victim. So, next punishment is garrote. So, a garrote, this is a device used in strangling condemned persons. In one form, it consists of an iron collar attached to a post. The victim's neck is placed in the collar, and the collar is slowly tightened by a screw until a asphyxiation occurs. Another form of garrote is a length of wire with wooden handles at the ends, held by the executioner. Next is the death by sewing. So, the victim would be hung upside down and slowly sewn in half. Uh, if sewn all the way, they would die, but often the victim was only sewn up to the stomach and left to die, which could potentially take several days. And then next is the death by hanging. So, this is the suspension of a person by a nose or ligature around the neck, and also uh, hanging is the sense is specifically to put to death by a suspension by the neck, though it formerly also referred to crucifixion and death by impalement, in which the body would remain hanging. So the hanging has been a common method of a capital punishments since medieval times, and is the primary execution method numerous countries and religions. So the fine, penalty, or money that court of law or other authority decide has to be paid as punishment for a crime or other offense. So in the fine punishment, it is the fixed monetary sanction imposed by a judge based on the severity of the crime committed and the ability of the offenders to pay. And also, it is imposed either as a principal or alternative penalty for the commission of crime. So next is distiro. So in distiro, in the crime punishable by distiro as any legally married person who, having surprised his spouse in the act of committing sexual intercourse and with another person, shall kill any of them or both of them in the act or immediately thereafter. They shall inflict upon them any serious physical injury, shall suffer penalty of distiro. There are three early prisons. The first one is Mamertine prisons, or what we call Carcer Tolilanium. So this built by a king Anzo Marzio in the 7th century BC. According to tradition, the apostles Peter and Paul were locked up there before undergoing martyrdom. So next is the Bridewell Workhouse. So the first most popular workhouse in 1570, located in London, which was built for the employment and housing of England prisoners. Next is the Walnut Street Jail. So was the pioneering effort in prisons reform, and originally built as a conventional jail just before the American Revolution. It was expanded in 1790 and held as a model of enlightenment thinking about criminals, and the prisons in fact was known as penitentiary. So next, the first pioneers is William Penn, from 1614 to 1718. He was the first leader to prescribe imprisonment as a correctional treatment for major offenders. So, William Penn was the first state prison systems to suggest the replacement of torture and mutilation as the punishments for crimes with hard labor in houses of correction. So, Penn's intentions were not systematically executed when his penal code of 1682 was repealed, and as a result, labor in penal institutions was practically non-existent in Pennsylvania during the colonial. The next is the Charles Montequin from 1689 to 1755. He was the French historian and philosopher of who analyzed law as an expression of justice. So Charles Louis Montesquieu, he was the outstanding thinker of the French Enlightenment in the first half of the 18th century, and he sociologist and philosopher that laid the foundation for the theory of the bourgeois state of the science of the law. And next is Voltaire from 1694 to 1778. He believes that fear of shame was deterrent to crime. So Voltaire was a French writer and a public activist who played a singular role in defining the 18th century movement called Enlightenment. And at the center of his work, um, he was a new conception of philosophy and a philosopher that, in the several crucial respects, influenced the modern concept of it. So, Voltaire believes that the fear of shame was deterrent also to crime. So next is Cesar Bonsana Marchis de Vicaria from 1737 to 1794. He presented the humanistic goal of law, and based on the assumption that people are free of will and thus completely responsible for their own actions, and that they also have the ability to rationally weigh up their abilities. So Cesare Bonsana Marchis de Vicaria, um, he was the author of Crimes and also The Punishment. Next is Jeremy Bentham from 1746 to 1832. He was the greatest leader in the form of English criminal law and the one who desired the ultimate panoptical prison. So when we say panoptical prison, it is a type of institutional building and a system of control designed by the English philosopher and social theorist. So Jeremy Bentham, he was the theory of moletary or the panoptical presence. Next is John Howard. So John Howard from 1726 to 1790, Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1773, who devoted his life and fortune to prison reform. So John Howard was an 18th century English philanthropist who made significant contribution in prisons reform. So despite personal tragedy and an oppositional social climate, he became an early promoter of human treatment for prisoners. So there are judicial conditions of penalty. First, productive of suffering. It is a punishment must be productive of suffering without affecting the integrity of human personality. So in productive of suffering, these are the punishment that suffer the without affecting the integrity of our individual's personality. Next is commensurately with the offense. These are the like we all know that there are different crimes, and those who have commit crimes they punish in different penalty. The next is personal. The guilty one must be the one to be punished. So this requires that the offender would have to suffer for his transgression to the law and not be imposed on others. The one who violated the law must be punished and no proxy. Next is legal. The consequence must be in accordance with the law. So this means that due process must be observed before the imposition of punishments, and penalty must be in accordance with the law. So next is the equal or equal for all persons. So this means that the state must have the apply the laws without bias and favor, and its imposition is general and it must be equally applied to all. The next is certain. No one must escape its effect. So this means that no one must escape the effects of penalty. The next is correctional changes that attitude of offenders and become law-abiding citizens. So this means that the penalty must be able to redeem and uplift the valuable human material and prevent unnecessary deprivation and levity and economic usefulness. So classification of detains undergoing investigation. So the accident is currently being examined in order to determine the facts. And next is the awaiting or undergoing trial. So this is a trial is formal hearing in a law court when a judge and jury hear evidence and deliberate whether or not a person is guilty of a crime. Next is a awaiting final judgment. Um, the written decision of the judge who presided over the trial or heard a successful motion to dismiss a stipulation for judgment which renders makes findings on all matters and all concludes unless it is appealed to a higher court. So the BGMP or the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, this is to seize operational and administrative responsibility of all city, district, and municipal jails. Government agencies pass a law, and also it takes custody of detainees accused before the court who are temporarily incarcerated in such facilities while undergoing investigation, awaiting final judgment, and or serving a term of 3 years or less imposed by the court. Next is the senior superintendent. So it means which of the BGMP directors of the directorates that the headquarters has the highest rank, and the regional director for jail management and penology has this position as well. Next is chief of the BGMP. So this means that the officer with the highest rank and the president appoints the director after receiving a recommendation from the DILG secretary rank. Next is the VGMP deputy chief for administration. This means that the second highest rank that the residence appoints of the chief superintendents mm, on the suggestion of the DILG secretary. Next is the Borstal system. So formally, it is used in Great Britain to rehabilitate delinquent adolescents ages 16 to 81 that the Gladstone um, comet committee came up with a motion in an attempt to reform young offenders in 1895, and Borstal Jail in Kent, England became the first institution in 1902. Next is the PD number 603. This means that it was enacted to provide for the care and treatment of young offenders from the moment they were apprehended until the ca- case was closed. So there are three major government functionaries involved in the Philippines correctional system. First, DOG, DILG, and DSWD. So let's talk about the DOG. So it means that it supervises the national penitentiaries and also the parole and the provision systems, where the president in the grant of executive clemency through the board of pardons and parole. Next is DILG. So it means that the uh, provision or district or the municipality jails, where the governments and the Bureau of Management respectively uh, manage the penology. Next is a DSWD. This means that through the Bureau of Child and Youth Welfare, they supervises the Regional Rehabilitation Center for Juvenile Offenders. So the history of national prison system, the pre-colonial and Spanish regime. So um, I explained that the informal persons systems was community-based during pre-colonial periods, as there were no national penitentiaries to speak of, and indigenous who disobeyed or violated local rules were punished by the local chieftains, and the purpose of incarceration in the community was to keep the perpetrator from causing more harm to the community members. Next is the Old Believed prisons. So from 1847, so the Manila City Jail, popularly known as Old Believed prisons, and it is a detention center in Manila, Philippines. That the jail is one of the most overcrowded in the world, or that we called Old Believed prison. And the next one is San Ramon Prison and Penal Farm, from August 21, 1869. So um, based on the BOCOR, or the Bureau of Corrections, the San Ramon Prison and Penal Farm was established on August 21, 1870, and through a royal decree promulgated in 1869 during the tenure of Governor General Raymond Blanco, and it said that the facility was originally established for persons convicted of political crime or political crimes. Let's talk about crime and the Catholic community. So, the next page. Catholic Christianity also teaches that people should be treated fairly, and God wants the world to be ruled justly. And the third one, many crimes treat people unfairly. Punishments ensure that justice is done, and Catholics do not believe in taking revenge when they have been wrong. So, um, Catholics do not believe in taking revenge when they have been wrong, because they believe that they should forgive the sins of others in the same way that they believe God forgiveness, or and forgives them for their sins. So, Catholic Christianity say about how criminals should be treated. So, Catholic believe in justice and therefore believe that criminals should be treated justly. They follow the example of Jesus, who taught that Christians should reform sinners and not be judgmental in their attitude. So, many Catholics are concerned about the welfare of prisoners, and also they may campaign for prisons reform and visit prisoners, and also uh, root for a political party that reflects their views on justice, equality. So there are some dimensions of crime and punishments in the US. So it means that the criminal activity has dropped in the last decade,
has been the subject of considerable debate, and some argue that high incarceration rates and total sentence here made the difference. Others point to the community policing, economic prosperity, and also fewer young people. So, the punishment in the United States is first is sentences. So in 2018, the Philippines held the 60th highest prison population out of 21 Asian countries. As of 2019, the Philippines population rested at 108.31 million people, and 215,000 of those people were incarcerated. So Philippines, unfortunately, they are mismanaged and overcrowded. In the next slide, there are five important facts about the incarceration system in the Philippines. So these are the five facts about the Philippines incarceration system. First, severe overcrowding. Second, pre-trial detains. Third, high death tolls. Fourth, vigilant justice. And fifth, corruption. So first, let's talk about severe overcrowding. So, severe overcrowding, it is a person's overcrowding is a social phenomenon occurring when the demand or for space in presence in a jurisdiction exceeds the capacity for prisoners, and the issues associated with prisons overcrowding are not new and have been brewing for many years. So, overcrowding in prisons is a major contributors to bad jail conditions around the world. So it is also arguably the most serious problem confronting present system, with effects that can be life-threatening at worst and hinder institutions from performing their functions at best. Every year, this situation is unfortunately hardly a surprise. We read about degrading conditions in which people are imprisoned and about their growing number. The reports chapter on drugs and imprisonment point out that a large number of jails around the world are overcrowded as a result of people being incarcerated for drug related offenses. So, particularly non-violent offenses involving personal use and possessions. This reflects our society's current addition to punishment. I have here example of an article also claim that that since the 30s anti-drug campaign began in 2016, Philippine jails have been um, became increasingly more packed, profiling the overall prison system to the top of the most overcrowded incarceration systems in the world. So, Philippine authorities should release detainees who have been imprisoned or convicted for low-level and non-violent offenses from the country's overcrowded jails and prisons. So, uh, they should also consider releasing older inmates and those with underlying medical issues who might be more vulnerable and infected. So, the Philippines has the world's highest jail occupancy rate, exacerbated by the Duterte government's war on drugs, and which has resulted in the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of people since July 2016, and thousands of people have been arrested and detained for violating curfews and quarantine restrictions since March 2020. So, adding to the already overcrowded police lockups and jails, that the Philippine government should urgently reduce detentions facility overcrowding by releasing minor offenders and um, prioritizing the release of older prisoners and those with underlying health conditions. Next, the Philippines has the world highest jails occupancy rates. Yes, that's I discussed while ago. I report it while ago. So there are five facts of severe overcrowding. First, high rates of presence overcrowding. So it means that can be found in all regions of the world. And the second one is
do not have the minimum space requirement. So in many prison systems, detains do not have the minimum space requirements recommended by the international standards, and in some cases spending up to 23 hours of the day, if not all day, in overcrowded cells. Overcrowding can be so severe that prisoners sleep in shifts on top of each other and share beds, or tie themselves to window bars so that they can sleep while standing. Next, only periodic amnesties and pardons relieve overcrowding. So, in some countries, only periodic amnesties and pardons relieve overcrowding. While this provides short-term relief, they do not offer a sustainable solution and can erode public confidence in the criminal justice system. And in others, costly presence building programmers are undertaken to meet the growing demand for presence places. So in 2020, many presence systems announced unprecedented mass releases of people in presence, and to reduce overcrowding and the risk of the transmission of COVID-19 in places of detention. Then the last one is some groups are particularly adversely affected by present overcrowding. So, for example, the needs of women and children in detention, already often given little attention, tend to be even more neglected in overcrowded and overstretched prison systems. Then next, the pre-trial detains. So, um, it means that the pre-trial detention restrict the right to presumption of innocence and the right to liberty, and it is the one of the harshest actions that a state can against someone and can have devastating consequences. Detained people are separated from their family and friends, at risk of losing their job and home, and can have their reputation ruined. So, in the stage of this court, um, the pre-trial stage is also when the issues are simplified by the parties with the guidance of the court before the trial. So this will allow the parties to limit the issues to be heard and tried during the trial. So it is also at this point when the parties can enter into stipulations or admissions of facts and documents to avoid unnecessary proof during the trial. The next, this one, during the pre-trial, the parties are required to first marks the respective evidence, if not yet marked, in the judicial affidavits of their witnesses. So, during the pre-trial parties, the Supreme Court can always revisit and update the rules of court in order to keep up with the evolving needs of the legal system. Judges, on the other hand, as frontline officers in the administration of justice, must ensure that the rules of court are properly followed by the parties, and that the parties and their counsel respect and comply with our court's orders and processes. So the next five facts of incarceration is high death tolls. So what is high death tolls? It is a number of people who died in an accident, disaster, war, or more. And it is 1 in 5 detainees at the Philippines National Penitentiary die every year, officials at the prisons have revealed. And according to CNN affiliate, CNN Philippines, some 5,200 inmates at the new Believed Presence or NBP die each year as a result of overcrowding, disease, and violence, according to Hospital Medical Superintendent Ernesto Tamayo. So, in addition to overcrowding, poor living conditions and inmate violence, NBP lacks like
lacks of nutrition food and basic health care. And according to CNN Philippines, Tamayo stated during a Senate hearing on Thursday that overcrowding has resulted in uncontrollable outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. Yes, because they lack of nutrition food and basic health care. So in the next slide, I have here an example of this one. So, Quezon City Jail, just outside the capital Manila, is home to over 4,000 inmates. So, the large number of frightening, but is not a new issue, and other jails across the country are experiencing similar issues. When CNN visited a Quezon City jail in 2016, over 4,000 inmates were living side by side in one of the Philippines' most densely inhabited areas. So the detainees were packed into recruity cells in deplorable conditions, and there's scarcely enough room for them to sleep, with 85 inmates cramped into a 200 square foot room. Another same what larger but not by much held 131 people. It was made for 30 people, and critics believe um, that the overcrowding is a natural result of the 30s drug war. So, vicious and brutal campaign on the methamphetamine trade that. So, according to Tamayo, at least one prisoner dies at NBP every day as a result of terrible living conditions. And thankfully, lawmakers and prisons workers in the Philippines are cooperating to alliterate the presence overpopulation, and human rights activities have also asked for the release of vulnerable convicts in order to protect them from the harsh condition in which they are held. So next is vigilant justice. So vigilant justice often describes the action of a single person or group of people who claim to enforce the law but lack the legal authority to do so. However, the term can also describe a general state of disarray or lawlessness in which competing groups of people all claim to enforce the law in a given area. So, in the next page, I have here some example of article of vigilant justice. So, President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has a bizarre concept for a job creation program, and he hired and employed people to kill criminal suspects. So, as Duterte told a group of returning overseas Filipino, if you lose your job, I'll provide you one. So, the Filipino workers assassinate all drug addicts, and Duterte's most recent call for vigilant killings is unsurprising. As part of his anti-drug campaign, he has repeatedly urged the people to murder drug users. So, for this, Duterte has also called on Philippine National Police to use extrajudicial violence against suspects. So, the Filipino people should oppose Duterte's drug war and join the increasing international outcry demanding accountability for the thousands of people who have died as a result of it. So, the Philippines drug war has instilled the attitude that extrajudicial killing and violence are required to combat criminality. So, human rights flip the narrative on the 30s by disseminating facts on the Philippines vigilant justice system. So, next is corruption. So, corruption is a dishonest or illegal behavior, especially by powerful people such as government officials or police officers. So, we all know that the corruption is a constant in the society and occurs in all civilizations. However, it has only been in the past 20 years that this phenomenon
has begun being seriously explored. It has many different shapes as well as many various effects, both on the economy and the society at large. Among the most common causes of corruptions are political and economic environment, professional ethics and morality, and of course, habits, costumes, tradition, and demography and its effects on the economy and also on the wider society. So, um, so the corruption thus inhibits economic growth and affects business operations and employment and investments. It also reduces tax revenue and the effectiveness of various financial assistance programs, and the wider society is influenced by a high degree of corruptions in terms of lowering of trust in the law and the rule in the rule of the law and education and consequently the quality of life, access to infrastructure, healthcare, and these are also does not exist, and an ambiguous answer as to how to deal with corruption. So something that works in one country or in one region will not necessarily be successful in another. So next slide. There is no silver bullet for fighting corruption. Many countries have made significant progress in curbing corruption. However, practitioners are always on lookout for solutions and evidence of impact. So, in the next slide, there are 5 ways that citizens and governments can make progress in the fight against corruptions. So, first is in impunity. So, the effective law enforcement is essential to ensure the corrupt are punished and break the circle of impunity or freedom from punishment or loss. So, successful enforcement approaches are supported by a strong illegal framework, law enforcement branches, an independent and effective court system, civil society in support the process with initiatives such as the Transparency International and Mass the Corrupt campaign. So the next one is reform public administration and finance and management. Reforms focusing on improving financial management and strengthening the role of auditing agencies have in many countries achieved greater impact than public sector reforms on curbing corruption. And next is promote transparency and success to information. So, um, countries successful at curbing corruption have a long tradition of government openness and freedom of the transparency and success to information. So, it access to information increases the responsiveness of government bodies while simultaneously having a positive effect on the levels of public participation in the country. So next is the empower citizens. So strengthening citizens' demand for anti-corruption and empowering them to hold government accountable is a sustainable approach that helps to build mutual trust between citizens and government. And for example, community monitoring initiatives have in some cases contributed to the detection of corruption and reduce leakage of funds and improve the quantity and quality of public service. Then the next one is close international loopholes. So without access to the international financial systems, corrupt public officials throughout the world would not be able to launder and hide the proceeds of looted state assets. So major financial centers urgently need to put in place ways to stop their banks and operating offshore financial centers from absorbing illicit flows of money. So the conclusion of this corruption is the correction is deep marked on the face of humanity today. No development, peace, prosperity, and process, it can be ensured unless the corruption is controlled. That would be all, and thank you and God bless.